Welcome to HiveMind. This is Edge. I have my co-host, the Speaker, here with me. How's it going, Speaker?
I'm good. A lot of technical difficulties, but we got there.
We did. Oh, it's wild out there.
Yeah, I know, right?
Today we're going to talk about something that I think is relevant to all of the chaos in the streets. We're going to talk about the right to bear arms. And we're also going to talk about the attack on the Second Amendment in America. You ready to go?
I'm ready to go. Let's roll.
All right. So there's been an attack on the Second Amendment for years, but it's kind of come to the forefront in public conversation in light of these recent events that we've seen in streets. But this month in particular, we've had, Pelosi calling for more gun control measures on the anniversary of the Florida nightclub attack. We also had the Supreme Court has denied petitions for appeals of 10 gun rights cases. And while we're seeing our rights under the Second Amendment being eroded, now more than ever in recent history, we're also seeing a need for law-abiding citizens to have the right to bear arms. But before we get into the current chaotic situation, I'd like to just take a step back and look at the history of gun rights in both of our countries, because I think there's some lessons to be learned there. And Speaker, I don't know if many Americans are aware of Australia's history with gun rights, but I thought we would take some time to look at that. So could you tell us what they were like before that gun grab that happened? Was it in the 90s?
Well, it was in '96, but let's state what the Second Amendment is first, for those that are not, or that are just tuning in on it, that don't exactly know. It's a well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That's the Second Amendment as it was written. So now we'll go to Australia. And in 1996, because there is a lot of comparisons that people try to use between Australia and is Australia's the way to go for when it comes to gun regulations. But there's a lot they don't tell you about Australia. So in 1996 was massive gun reform after the Port Arthur massacre in Tasmania, which was committed by a man named Martin Bryan, who killed 35 people. So that was the biggest massacre in Australia. But what people don't know is even after 96, there has been 6 mass shootings here. But they don't really bring that up. Okay? That they haven't been as severe as the Port Arthur one. It was probably the biggest one we've had in modern day history. But there still has been some.
What was gun culture like before the 96 gun grab?
Oh, we're country people. I mean, I was still young, but gun culture was big. I mean, shooting, hunting was very big among Australians, just because of the massive land that we have. I remember vaguely. I mean, I was still relatively young back then, but I do remember when all this happened. And what a lot of people don't know is even after that, and they tried to, they eventually did push massive gun control laws within Australia. A lot of people protested against it. My uncles and all that being one of them. Because I think, I mean, I haven't asked them directly, but I know the type of people they are. They were brought up in Asia. They know what it's like to be under tyrannical rule, and they know what it's like to fight in wars. They're hard nut people. So when they tried to take their guns away, of course they were out there protesting. But so the big change that happened in Australia was a full gun control of all. It was a federal ban on all imported semi-automatics, self-loading, and pump-action long arms, and all parts including to that. So magazines, silencers, everything like that. So I think it ended up with the gun buyback being around 650,000 firearms that was bought back by the government and then eventually destroyed. So this is a big move to disarm citizens. And of course, back then, not many people thought anything of it because there is such a huge disparity between Australia and between America, and people don't cite these differences. Has it worked? Well, we don't really know because, like I said, there has been still six mass shootings after that, which doesn't really get brought up in mainstream media much. But apart from that, there's been heaps of massacres in Australia. There's been arson attacks. They've risen heaps. So it seems to me bad people find ways to do bad things.
Right. Because what you're doing is you're regulating the law-abiding citizens, but not really addressing the criminal aspect of it. So I was going to ask you about that. Did it kind of create a black market for guns after the gun grab?
It's hard to say. A lot of bikies and all that kept their guns. A lot of criminals and all that kept their guns. Most gun shootouts that you see or hear about in Australia today are really gang-related, mostly. It's really hard to get handgun licenses here. It's hard to get gun licenses here, just in general. You can get them, but of course you can't get semi-automatics, pump actions, and everything they've cancelled out.
What's the general consensus now? I mean, are most people for this, or are people still pretty resentful about having their abilities to bear arms taken away?
I think from the few people that I've talked to, people are now becoming more aware of it after seeing what's going on in America and seeing, because I think there has been a blanket of illusion over the West. And that blanket of illusion is this illusion of safety.
Right.
This illusion of comfort. I mean, the average everyday person, and a lot of people that I know, don't even think about a tyrannical government.
Right.
They don't think about it. Like it's not even in their mindset. They're like, this can't happen in the West. This can't happen.
Yes.
And it's definitely a blanket of comfort and illusion. But of course, there is people that are slowly waking up to this now, going, shit, look what's happening in America. Look at these riots. Look at what's going on. You have two completely different opposing government parties. And people are slowly waking up. So I've got a few friends that have been asking me about it, just in general. And they're like, man, I'm starting to understand this gun debate a little bit. I'm like, oh, now you see it. Right? It's a bit late for us, but now you see it. Everyone tries to compare Australia to America and what should be done in America. And the truth of the matter is it won't work.
Right.
It won't work.
It won't, because we have the Second Amendment. I don't think you guys had a bill that had it set in stone.
No, we don't. No.
Right. So it made it a lot easier to justify taking it away, because it was never an inherent right from your beginning, the foundation of your country.
No. But people also have to understand. They have to break it down. A gun buyback, even if you didn't have your amendment, would never work in America. There's too many guns. Right?
There is, yeah.
There's too many guns now, right? And you got to look at the population of Australia in '96. Like even massacres in general were rare in Australia, even prior to Port Arthur. And the funny thing about it was only 13 days after Port Arthur when all of this got put into place.
Which makes you kind of think, too, because I was going to bring this up. I was looking back at when these gun restriction laws were put into place in various places like Australia and in the UK, and when they tried to do it here in the US after the Florida nightclub shooting and various other shootings, when they always bring it up. But it's interesting how these mass shootings are the catalyst to justify these laws, these gun restriction laws. And if I were a tyrannical government and I wanted to justify taking the guns from my citizens, then wouldn't that give me a motive to create a mass shooting situation?
Mm-hmm.
So,
I mean, we can go down the rabbit hole on that. Right?
We can, and we've definitely have done that. In each instance when there was a mass shooting, all the different inconsistencies and connections and so forth. I don't think we're going to go too in depth with all that.
And the MK Ultra, but all this can be a show on its own.
Right. Yes.
But that we'll definitely do another show on that later on. But yeah, like going back to the differences between Australia and America at the moment, because people really need to understand that in '96, the population of Australia was roughly about 18 million. Okay, at 18 million on the landmass that we have, that is nothing. And today still, it's only 25 million in Australia. Right? And in comparison, California has 40 million people alone.
Right.
Okay, so like these things are not going to work in a country like the United States, and I'm sick of people trying to push it, right? Because it's just not going to work. And one, we're an isolated island. We're not bridged onto South America. That's one of the huge problems you have.
It is a big problem. Yes.
Is illegal guns coming up throughout the border? Why do you think people want a border wall? You know, once you start breaking it down, most of either drugs, weapons, sex trafficking is all coming through your border.
Exactly.
It's all coming up from South America. So Australia would be a lot different place if we were bordered on Asia.
Right. Very true. I wanted to talk about the American history and the founders when they created the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. So the founders, they knew all too well about the oppression of federal government, that it can impose on its own people, having experienced, the tyrannical rule of the British. They made it the Second Amendment because the right to bear arms was the one right that ensured all of the other rights. So the founders had this foresight to understand the tyrannical nature of governments, but they really couldn't possibly have imagined the horrors of the 20th century. I mean, of millions of people being killed by their own governments. There's two consistencies. One, they control the press, and two, they disarm the people, right?
That's it. They are the two common things that you always see before some sort of tyrannical government takes over any country.
Right. And so I think that in Western culture, especially now, we've forgotten a lot of that history. It seems like it's all so far in the past, and we can possibly imagine that happening here today.
It's the comfort illusion.
It is that you were just talking about.
Yeah.
So, gun control advocates, they, say the Second Amendment is outlived its usefulness. They always use this argument that, the founding fathers couldn't have possibly envisioned these modern day weapons we have today. But, the Second Amendment refers to arms. It didn't say anything about muskets, It refers to arms because arms is really just any weapon that's common to that time period. So the phrasing, it is as relevant now as it was back then, because just the point is any weapon that's common to the time period, any weapon in the hands of a tyrant is still a weapon of oppression. And on the other side, that same weapon is a tool of citizens to protect themselves against oppression. But people just don't realize that because they've lived in such comfort for so long, they can't really remember what a tyrannical, oppressive government could look like. And
it's happened in modern day times. People don't realize that China is a tyrannical government.
Right.
Xi Jinping is the dictator. There is no if or buts by it, but it's like people overlook it. It's like a mask. I mean, the man made himself president for life. He has massive control over the military, and he has massive control over his people when it comes to censoring, and when it comes to any resurgence, you don't hear from those people again.
Exactly.
Right? It's happening right now.
It is, and I think that's a good reason why people are waking up to this here in America and around the world, is that tyrannical governments are really starting to show their true colors as of lately. So we're starting to realize this, in America, and the need for the Second Amendment and to preserve our right to bear arms. The only way one could argue that the Second Amendment is not necessary is if you could guarantee peace for all citizens and that no man would ever become corrupted by power, but that's just not possible.
Yeah, that's a utopian fantasy.
Exactly. And people want to live in this utopian fantasy, but the actuality is that you can't guarantee peace, and you cannot guarantee that there will not be uh, corruption by power.
Hmm.
And so the only way to protect the citizens from oppression is that the citizens can protect themselves by arming themselves.
I think it also comes down a lot to personal responsibility. A lot of people, like I said, that blanket of comfort during the West. When it comes to crime and all that, a lot of people living in these middle class neighborhoods, they feel like they're completely safe. But the truth of the matter is, if something does blow out of hand, and it's kind of what you're seeing in America now, rioters, people going to the suburbs, um, you can't always call the police, and it comes down to personal responsibility of the human being to protect what is yours. Protect my family, protect my kids, protect my wife. It's my responsibility to do that before the police.
Right. And we see that, especially playing out right now with these riots in the streets and threats to go after, suburban areas, police standing down. Um, it just seems like it's more obvious than ever that need for civilians to have the right to bear arms should be protected. But not only is the Second Amendment good for that, it's also a deterrent, of foreign invaders. There are mixed reports about why Japan didn't invade the mainland United States after Pearl Harbor, but I don't think anybody can really argue with the fact that, about 300 million guns in the United States, an armed American citizen
That's a lot of guns.
community
Never noticed that.
is a deterrent for
Hmm.
foreign invasion of mainland, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
Definitely, but I think that's more secondary. I think it
definitely
is more,
secondary.
yeah, I think it's more in domestic cases.
Yeah, and getting to that, it protects the people, the citizens, if there's some kind of violent insurrection occurring and the federal and local government fail to protect the citizens, is what we're seeing right now in America today.
Yeah, we're seeing that play out, and like I said, compared to like here in Australia and America, we're a very young country, and we're very behind you in ways. Um, America is the process that other Western countries will start to go down, right?
Right.
If this keeps going this way, which I hope we're trying to put a block on it in some way, and people are seeing how crazy this is,
Right.
and all start standing up to stop it.
Well, if you want to look at gun laws and kind of figure out how just various restrictions on the Second Amendment, how that's helped or not helped, I mean, you could look at case studies of different cities in America, and say, well, how do these gun restriction laws help? Well, say Illinois, for example, it's ranked 8th in the country for gun restrictions. Yet, Chicago, they had 1,274 shootings in Chicago in 2019, and it's constantly, at the top 10 cities in America with the highest murder rate. So you could argue that really those gun restriction laws are only restricting the law-abiding. Same thing with New York City. Shootings have spiked actually this year in 2020. They're more than what they were so far. They're more than what they were for the whole of 2019. And that state is ranked 6th in the U.S. for the strictest gun laws. But on the flip side, if you look at, say, Arizona, and they have some of the least restrictive gun laws in the country, and you take, like, Tucson, for example, it's still up there as far as a high crime city. But the point is that it's more about the criminal elements in those local areas and stomping those out, combating those, rather than the gun restriction laws that are actually going to make an effect on those statistics of shootings and murders.
This only hurts law-abiding gun owners. It doesn't
Exactly.
hurt those with illegal arms.
Yes, and what you really have to do is you have to go after the criminal element. I mean, with, say, for example, Tucson, they have any kind of border city or state is going to have an issue with illegal immigration and with cartels. And so that is the element that you have to really go after hard if you want to get those statistics down of shootings and of murders. Same thing goes with like Chicago or New York. You really need to look at, gang violence and start addressing that, the criminal aspect of things if you want to get those statistics down. It's not necessarily going to be the gun restriction laws that are doing it, because the criminal elements are not obeying the laws. Most of those guns, I would venture to say, are purchased on the black market. So
the majority of them.
Right.
That's why it boggles my mind when you see people going after the NRA and stuff like there's never been a mass shooter that was a member of the NRA, right?
No.
These organizations are set to train people to responsibly use firearms, right? And people go after them like they're causing it all. No, your gun traffickers are causing it all, right? Most of these people and most of these shootings, especially school shootings, have a tendency that they could have been stopped. There is always a lead up to it, whether it's reports to the police of that individual, things on their Facebook and their social media, which is really given away that people that should be like, yeah, there's something wrong with this kid. Or in the last case, I forgot the school's name, but the one with David Hogg. That shooter was reported to the FBI 3, 4, 5 times.
Right.
Nothing was done.
Nope. And we've had theories as to why nothing was done. And why that shooting took place in the first place, which we kind of referred to, and that we'll have to spend a whole other podcast talking about MK Ultra,
Definitely.
and using these cells, sleeper cells, to carry out black ops for the purposes of, say, justifying legislation to restrict gun laws, for the purposes of disarming the citizens, because you can't really move towards that new world order, one world government, tearing down the sovereignty of America without that. You cannot. They know they have to take away our guns. That is going to be their hardest battle, is to be able to take away our guns in order for us to forfeit our sovereignty.
I don't see the majority of Americans doing it.
Especially now.
Definitely not.
Especially now. Let's talk about what's going on right now. I mean, fast forward to current events today. We've got these riots in the streets. We've got Antifa members plotting to go into residential areas, riot and loot. We've got autonomous zones springing up, police standing down, walking off the force. I mean, now more than ever, we see a need for well-armed citizens.
You have people getting dragged out of cars, getting beaten on the street, getting robbed. And their own stores and their property getting looted. You have a right to protect all those things, and you have a right to protect yourself as well. And that's why you have the 2A. I mean, if that was to happen down here, it's not much people could do. I mean, there's still guns around, but when it comes to your everyday average citizen that is being blanketed with this illusion of comfort, they're in trouble. If someone broke into their house or broke into their business, there's not much that's going to be done within the 10, 20 minutes it takes to the cops to get there. A lot of bad things are going to happen.
Absolutely. I mean, you take the UK, for example, and you probably know a little bit more about that with their, being disarmed and everything, and even the police not having arms.
They're completely neutered in the UK. They're completely neutered.
Right. And what have you seen with regards to the riots, and in particular, their inability to defend themselves or the citizens?
If the cops can't defend the citizens against rioters and protesters and are just letting them do these things, there's not much hope for you in the long run. I have a black-pilled opinion on the UK.
Right. It's almost like it's gone too far. at this point. It's really hard to see it turning back. It's difficult. I know we have some listeners probably from the UK. We're feeling for you, but and hopefully America can be still this bastion of hope that the citizens can take their country back and establish law and order and sovereignty again. So, I think that we're not alone in this conversation. We're not alone in this line of thinking. In fact, since before the riots started, when we were just in quarantine during the pandemic, when people feared that there was going to be this erosion of law and order and a societal breakdown due to the quarantine, gun sales spiked. In fact, the FBI conducted 3.7 million background checks in March alone, which was the highest since the instant background check program began in '98. And gun retailers are reporting huge spikes in sales in March alone. Before the riots, over 2 million guns were purchased in March. So that gives you an indication of what all of this chaos in the streets, even before they started happening, it was kind of predicted. It was in the zeitgeist of the citizens. They kind of predicted that was going to happen, and they preemptively started buying up the guns. Yeah, what do you think about that?
Yeah, there was this good photo. I'm not sure where it was, but it was a line of people lining up to the gun shop, like consider it like it was happening probably halfway through these riots, so a couple of weeks ago, and there were so many people in line. It wasn't even funny, and different nationalities. There was a couple of black guys there. You could see 2 or 3 Jewish people there. Like I said, it's got nothing to do with race. People want to protect themselves and their own, and you can't blame them. Definitely not in this climate. And like I said, I've got friends now that are asking me about these things. They're like, dude, I'm really starting to understand the gun laws and stuff like that. And I'm like, well, see, now you're starting to see it. He goes, yeah, man, because before it wasn't really affecting my home and my wife and my kids, and so I guess I was kind of blasé about it. But when you start seeing it, and when it starts encroaching on my life and my family, then I've started to pay attention. I'm like, yeah, well, hopefully a lot more people do that.
Right. And I think that's happened all across America and the world, is that these issues that were maybe just really on the back burner for most citizens in their daily lives has really come to the forefront, where it's like, now it hits home. I have to protect my family. I have to protect my property. And there's really no indication or certainty in some cities that the police are actually going to do that, or that the city mayor or the state governor are going to do that. And so a lot of people are really understanding the necessity of the preservation of the Second Amendment, and the reason why the forefathers had the foresight to make that the Second Amendment, because all other amendments, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, all of these things in the First Amendment would not be guaranteed if there was not a citizenry that was armed or had the right to bear arms.
But it's so important to hold your constitution and to hold your amendments, because if one falls, the rest of them will start slowly falling. And that is something you can never do. And I think the American people are very aware of that. Well, the ones that are logically thinking and the ones that are seeing the world for what it is at the moment, they see what's happening. And there's no way, and like, this is worst case scenario, but if you have to fight and die to keep your amendments, I'm damn sure there's a lot of Americans that would.
Right, and it's not as though we as American citizens who support the Second Amendment are necessarily saying get out into the streets and start, the Civil War. No, it's actually used as a preventative to discourage the criminal elements from wanting to do that. Because
you'd rather have it and not use it.
Exactly. Exactly. And that gets me to this quote from Thomas Paine, one of our founding fathers, that I wanted to read off to you. Kind of sums that up before we close out, unless there's anything else we wanted to talk about.
Yeah, I think we've sorted it.
Okay. So here's what Thomas Paine said. Arms, like laws, discourage and keep the invader and the plunderer in awe, and preserve order in the world, as well as property. The same balance would be preserved were all the world destitute of arms, for all would be alike. But since some will not, others dare not lay them aside, horrid mischief would ensue were one half of the world deprived of the use of them.
Great way to finish it off.
Yeah, so you ready to wrap it up?
Well, let's wrap.
All right, guys. Thanks for listening to us here on Hive Mind with Speaker and Edge. Please be sure to share, like, subscribe, and hit that bell. We'll see you back next time, right here on Hive Mind.
Stay ravenous.